What is the doctrine of general revelation and how useful is it in scientific apologetics? Now, perhaps one of the greatest challenges facing the modern Christian church today is the conflict between science and the Bible. Now, many young-age creationists, they tell us, for example, that scientific evidence for supernatural creationism is ubiquitous and it is obvious. Now, on the other hand, many old Earth creationists and theistic evolutionists, they tell us quite the opposite, don't they? They tell us that scientific evidence, it sort of overwhelmingly supports the belief in an ancient Earth and or Darwinian evolution. Now, what's really remarkable to me is that both groups use the Bible's self-disclosure about the purposes of general revelation to support their own scientific conclusions. Now, it's important to distinguish passages on general revelation from creational passages. So Psalm 19 and Romans 1:18 to 23 are general revelation passages, while Genesis 1 to 3, chapters 1 to 3, are creational passages. Now, I'll talk more about these differences a little bit later. Okay, so let's look at the historical background for the doctrine. The doctrine of general revelation, it seeks to demonstrate that the attributes of God have and continue to be clearly perceived in the things that God has made, so that all humans are without excuse, and of course that comes from Romans 1. Now, in this video series, I'm only going to focus on the doctrine of general revelation, and I'm not really going to talk much about another similar area of theology called natural theology. This theology developed in the Middle Ages, like with Thomas Aquinas. Natural theology is more about using arguments from reason to prove the existence of God, like the argument of causality. Now, although the doctrine of general revelation and natural theology overlap in many ways, it is the doctrine of general revelation that I'm really going to drill down on in this series. The doctrine of general revelation has played a really important part in the Protestant church going all the way back to Calvin, and it continues to have an extraordinary influence on theologians and scientists in modern times. But just how useful is general revelation? Now, Calvin, he was one of the first reformers to articulate a doctrine of general revelation. Now, for example, Calvin said, "For the same reason the psalmist," speaking of Psalm 19, "attributes language to celestial objects, a language which all nations understand, the manifestation of the Godhead being too clear to escape the notice of any people, however obtuse." Now, essentially, Calvin is saying that many of God's attributes, so for example, his eternity or his divine nature, they can be discerned from the things that are made. So, for example, animals, planets and quarks, as well as the internal law of God that's written on the human heart, all speak about God in a very general way. Of course, Calvin completely refutes general revelation's ability to bring humans into a saving relationship with God. According to Calvin, only Scripture can do that. Now, later Protestant theologians such as C.G. Burkauer, he agreed with Calvin, but he wanted people to know that general revelation only really helps believers. So he said this, that Romans 1 is cited in Article 2 of the Belgic Confession is no accident, nor the fact that special reference is made to men's guilt, quoting Romans 1:20. The purpose of this record was to indicate the existence of revelation of God in all the works of his hands, but that man, who comes in daily contact with this revelation, in his unrighteousness wards off this truth. This is exactly the import of Romans 1. Now, Burkauer, and rightly I might add, was reacting against a growing rationalism in the church. Now, initially, the doctrine of general revelation proved useful to the church in its struggle against the popularity of atheism that started in the late 1700s and early 1800s, when a number of theologians started to accept Descartes' exaltation of human reason. Descartes believed that if we just use human reason, we can prove the existence of God. Well, this produced a number of theologians throughout the 18th and 19th centuries that essentially rejected the need for Scripture, claiming that human reason alone could prove God's existence. Now, these theologians, they framed their teachings along the lines of the natural theologies common in the Middle Ages, like with Thomas Aquinas. Burkow was reacting against this growing trend in the church and sought to bring people back to the Scriptures. Now, interestingly, some Protestant thinkers completely rejected the use of general revelation, even for believers. Neo-Orthodox theologian Karl Barth, for example, was one of the foremost opponents of this doctrine. According to Barth, any theological attempt to formulate theistic arguments for God's existence based on general revelation is not only wrong-headed and useless, but is in direct conflict with the grounding principles of the early reformers. And he didn't mince his words. He says this, for example, "Why then, in spite of all the refutations like those we have just made, can a theology of this kind continually arise, announcing itself anew in ever new forms, as if nothing had been said against it, and as if it had not been refuted, creeping into theological ventures which have quite different intentions, and like a rank weed, clinging even to what is apparently the soundest stalk, weakening it and finally killing it." Like I said, he didn't mince his words. Now, although disagreement exists between these different Protestant thinkers, the Protestant church, right up to the present, has generally agreed on the following uses of general revelation. First, general revelation only ever reveals and involuntarily impresses upon humans God's attributes, i.e. things like his transcendence, his creativity, or his power, his eternity, things like that. Now, by involuntarily, I mean these impressions, they're basic. They're not reasoned facts. For example, like the glory you sense when looking at the stars. Okay? All right, now, second, general revelation is inadequate to bring a person into a saving relationship with God. Third, all humans in their fallen state, they reject God's limited self-revelation found in general revelation, bringing upon themselves condemnation. Now, there is a fourth point, but it's highly disputed, and that is, how useful is general revelation for evangelism? Can we use arguments from nature to bring people to Christ? Okay, so that is a lot of information. It's a ton of information, which, by the way, I think is really, really cool. So join me in part 2, where we'll take a closer look at Psalm 19 and Romans 1, two of the most important texts in the Bible on general revelation. Okay, so that's all from me, Ken Coulson here at Creation Unfolding. Look, if you found this helpful, pound the like button, share this video on your social media platform. Go ahead and subscribe. And if you'd like to give, I always appreciate that. There's a link in the description. And look, prayer is absolutely essential. I really mean it. If you could spend just a few seconds and pray for Creation Unfolding Ministries, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you and goodbye.